Welcome. My name is Kurt Roloffs. I'm class of 1984. I'm the co-chair of the Intellectual Programming Committee of the Columbia College Alumni Association. My co-chair, Joanne Kwan, and I launched this series in conjunction with our partners in the college. In order to, this series is known as Big Topics and Short Takes, as a way for the CCA to quickly deliver conversations between faculty and alumni on topics of strong interest to our community. We are actively developing next year's programming, so please let us know of topics that you'd like us to speak to next year. Today's topic is free speech and the values of higher education by Professor Joshua Mitz of the law school. It's part of our theme on civil disobedience at Columbia, which has been running all year. Today's format will be a webinar. Professor Mitz will make a presentation of about 20 minutes, and that'll be followed by curated questions that have been offered by all of you. Some of those questions you've already delivered during the registration process, and we have curated them as best we can into a set of questions that we'll ask. But you are also welcome and very welcome to put any questions that you have during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A button and simply typing the questions in there. And then Joanne Kwan will curate those and forward them to me, and I'll ask them as best I can. I'm going to apologize in advance for not being able to get to everyone's questions. They're always great, but there are always too many for us to cover in a single session. With that, let me introduce Professor Mitz. He received his BA from Georgetown University and his law degree from Yale University before receiving his PhD from Columbia Business School. In 2017, he joined the law school faculty, and in 2022, he became the David J. Greenwald Professor of Law. And a full professor. Professor Mitz uses advanced data science techniques like machine learning for his primary research topics, which are related to informed trading and the laws related to the governance of the governance and operation of the securities markets. This semester, however, he's teaching something very close to this to today's talk. He's teaching along with Professor David M. Schitzer, who's the Dean Emeritus of the law school, a course titled Free Expression and Civil Rights on Campus. I am hoping that today's presentation and Q&A that follows will be a condensed exploration of that offering, and maybe a full-fledged mini-core offering to college students and alumni might arise in the not-too-distant future. And with that introduction, Professor Mitz, please launch into your presentation.
Thank you, Kurt. It's nice to be with everyone. Let me get my screen share going here. I love this idea of a mini core. These topics are of great interest to, I think, many members of our community, including our undergraduates. So it's, again, wonderful to be with you all today. I'm going to be speaking on free expression and the values of higher education. I'm going to start by, just to give you a little outline of this presentation, I'm going to start by speaking broadly about academic freedom and free speech at universities. From there, we'll talk about Columbia's own statutes from a legal perspective. We'll then take a look at some close calls and more difficult lines to draw around hate speech and calls for violence. And I'm going to say a few words about a path forward on some of the topics that are of particular interest today around viewpoint diversity and intellectual rigor. And then, of course, I'll take your questions, and I'm looking forward to a discussion with you. So let's start by asking some broad questions about the relationship between academic freedom and free speech and the university. I think the starting point really is that a university's foundation is academic freedom. without academic freedom, there cannot be a university. And this is, I think, inherent to what it means to pursue knowledge. In order to pursue knowledge, one must be able to render judgments and reach views and opinions and conclusions without political or financial or other pressures constraining the pursuit of truth. So academic freedom, one might say, is definitional to what a university is. It's also the case that a university rests on a foundation of freedom of expression. And as we'll see, that's true at Columbia, and it's true more broadly, that freedom of expression encompasses not only the freedom to conduct research and teach, but also to express one's views. Although the scope of academic freedom versus freedom of expression more broadly at a university might be different, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So if the foundation of a university is academic freedom and freedom of expression, what is the university's mission? And I think the mission of a university, in my view, can be said to foster an intellectually rigorous environment that is receptive to diverse opinions. And so we'll talk more about these components shortly, but intellectual rigor should be one of our core goals that we're trying to achieve at higher education. After all, higher education is about the pursuit of knowledge. And if we're not intellectually rigorous, then is this really education at the end of the day? Intellectual rigor is part and parcel to education. And I think another component of a university's mission is this receptivity to a wide range of views. Because one of the things that as an educator you learn is that you're not only constantly learning yourself, you're learning from your colleagues, you're learning from your students, and it is the receptivity to points of view you haven't considered which actually makes you intellectually rigorous. If you're not afraid to be challenged, then you're confident in the process of intellectual growth. By contrast, if you're not interested in hearing different opinions, what does that say about the degree to which your beliefs can withstand scrutiny? One of the challenges I think that we have at universities, again, on a high level, is how to develop a culture which encourages both sharp, respectful disagreement, and which is inherent to this process of discovering truth, while prohibiting harassment and intimidation. And I think this is a dividing line that's going to animate much of the discussion today. And at its core, it's really a cultural challenge, because this cultural challenge, this cultural component of a university needs to start with the people and with the environment. And ultimately, as a result of the difficulty that we'll talk about today, I think universities have struggled. And there's a story here, as of 2025, I think we find ourselves in a situation where universities have really struggled to welcome non-conforming views. And I'll say a little bit about this, and maybe we'll talk more about this in the Q&A. But I think one of the bases for distrust of higher education in American society is coming from the view that despite our mission as being in an intellectually rigorous environment that is supposed to be receptive to diverse opinions, we at universities have actually struggled with welcoming views outside of intellectual orthodoxies. So the path forward that I'll be hoping to lay out for you today is one in which universities actively embrace dissent, counter views, and questioning norms, but they do so in a rigorous and thoughtful way. And I'm going to try and keep those two values front and center during this conversation, both the embrace of dissent and doing so in a thoughtful and rigorous way that reflects our values as an institution. So with that high-level overview, let's take a look at Columbia's own university statutes. I'm just going to read from the preamble to our rules of university conduct. This won't be very long, but I think it's so beautifully written. The university, as a forum for the pursuit and attainment of knowledge in every field of human endeavor, has a special role in fostering free inquiry. A principal reason why universities have endured and flourished over centuries is that they provide a place for ideas to be tested, for values to be questioned, and for minds to be changed with as few constraints as possible. Like society at large, but even more so, the university has a vital interest in fostering a climate where nothing is immune from scrutiny. And Columbia in particular has a long tradition of valuing dissent and controversy and in welcoming the clash of opinions onto the campus. To be true to these principles, the university cannot and will not rule any subject or form of expression out of order on the ground that it is objectionable, offensive, immoral, or untrue. Viewpoints will inevitably conflict, and members of the university community will disagree with and may even take offense at both the opinions expressed by others and the manner in which they are expressed. But the role of the university is not to shield individuals from positions they find unwelcome. Rather, the university is a place for received wisdom and firmly held views to be tested and tested again, so that members of the university community can listen, challenge each other, and be challenged in return. So what are some of the principles that we take away from Columbia's own rules of university conduct as codified in the statutes of the university when it comes to freedom of expression? So the first principle is that there is no viewpoint or content-based exclusion at Columbia. So the university cannot and will not rule any subject or form of expression out of order on the grounds that it is objectionable, offensive, immoral, or untrue. Now, I want to say something about this point that may not be obvious to you. The fact that we do not exclude content on the basis of being objectionable, offensive, immoral, or untrue, of course, does not imply that there are no consequences to setting forth content of that nature. So, for example, if a student of mine were to cite a law that doesn't exist, that would be untrue content, and that would be reflected in their grade. But we're not prohibiting or disciplining or otherwise restricting the content that is expressed on campus on the ground that it is untrue. Putting forward propositions that are untrue can nonetheless have academic consequences, and that is inherent in our pursuit of our academic mission. Freedom of expression at the university, while generally reflecting the principle of no viewpoint or content-based exclusion, nonetheless has two basic exceptions. The first is content-neutral time, place, and manner regulation. What that means is that in order to protect others' right to teach, study, and demonstrate themselves, the university may place restrictions on the time, place, and manner of speech. This is always must be content neutral in its application. So it's not appropriate, for example, to place a time, place, and manner restriction on one group of protesters that you would not place on another, for example, or to say one kind of view can only be expressed for 5 minutes in class, while another view can have 30 minutes. Those viewpoint-based, those would be a form of viewpoint-based discrimination. Time, place, and manner restrictions must be content neutral. The university statutes also allow for the restriction of speech that constitutes a genuine threat of harassment, an unjustifiable invasion of privacy, or false defamation, because these forms of speech impair the university's truth-seeking mission. And we'll say a little bit more about that shortly. All other forms of expression, however controversial or offensive, are protected at Columbia in order to ensure an intellectually rigorous environment where ideas may be tested. So our fundamental guiding principle here is that Columbia should be a place in which robust debate is affirmed. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about some close calls, some areas where our principles have been challenged, and I've written an op-ed in the Columbia Spectator on this topic of hate speech and calls for violence. And so I'm going to lay out some of the points that I've written and discussed in some of the public conversations we've had here at Columbia over the recent year. We've seen over the past year students and even some faculty engage in rhetoric, for example, death to Zionists, personal slurs, Nazi analogies, which have at their core reflected an erosion of civil discourse at Columbia. On October 9th, 2024, the leadership of the university, that is the president, the provost, and the executive committee of the university senate, issued a statement affirming that calls for violence have no place at Columbia or any other university. And I'm not, just for time's sake, going into all of the contextual background for this statement, but it was made 2 days after the October 7th, 2024 events in which the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Coalition made statements that constituted calls for violence. And so this message by university leadership was prompted by those episodes. One of the first questions that I get when this topic is brought up is the question of the First Amendment. Some of you may know that the First Amendment does not prohibit calls for violence. There's some controversy over whether calls for violence, which are very local or which may constitute an immediate threat. I think if one can say that if a call for violence constitutes a true threat, it can be prohibited under the First Amendment. The harder area would be calls for violence against local individuals, people who are in your vicinity. Many scholars believe that can also be prohibited under the First Amendment. Most scholars, I think, would take the view that calls for violence directed at individuals who are not in your immediate vicinity, it is not clear whether that would be prohibiting those sorts of calls for violence would be consistent with the First Amendment. But the point that I've made publicly, and I think is important for us to consider, and I'm not the only one making this point. Our former president, Lee Bollinger, also in a recent interview, made a similar point that as a private university, Columbia is not bound by the First Amendment. And so, as former President Bollinger put it, it may be appropriate for us as a private university to have a conversation about whether we should craft our own limitations on certain forms of expression, like calls for violence. This is a complicated issue because drawing that line in and of itself is a tricky task. But what I have said publicly about this is that we need to remember that as an academic institution, disruptive speech, meaning speech that causes members of our community to genuinely fear for their personal safety, or to feel that the environment is a hostile one, that sort of speech interferes with our truth-seeking mission. And so there is a difference between an individual being offended by a statement that they find objectionable and an individual being unable to conduct research or pursue scholarship or study in class because the statements that are being made place that individual at a genuine fear concerning their own personal safety. The principle that I set forth in my op-ed on this topic is that we need to begin by remembering that the core foundation of a university, and Columbia is no exception, is to pursue academic freedom. What that means is that we should encourage sharp and even uncomfortable debate. We should reject the notion that there need to be safe spaces to have in which offensive ideas cannot be considered. We must be able to explore unpopular ideas, including in connection with the Israel-Gaza conflict or other geopolitical issues. The key, in my view, is to draw a firm line where speech creates specific imminent threats or otherwise advocates for violence on campus. As a private institution, Columbia has the latitude to decide these lines, while courts and judges draw these lines for public colleges. We have the opportunity, and I would say responsibility, to set these lines for ourselves. The reality is that Columbia, as a private institution, is competing in the market for higher education. We are competing for students. We are competing for donors, alumni, federal agencies, all of the above can choose other institutions to finance or other institutions to attend. Faculty can teach elsewhere. And so our credibility and our funding, our ability to function as a university hinge on the campus climate. And so it is incumbent upon us to consider the bounds of freedom of expression in light of our academic mission. Our academic mission is to pursue academic freedom, to pursue the discovery of truth. What that means is that when we're evaluating whether speech should be permitted at Columbia, we should do so with an eye to answering the question, does speech of this sort further our academic mission, or does it create such a hostile environment for members of our community that they are not able to engage in the core functions that make a university a university? And as I mentioned, I think if we're going to draw that line, it should be around imminent threats, specific threats, or advocating or calling for violence on campus against members of our community. In short, support for terrorist groups ultimately chills participation and degrades research, teaching, and learning, which are contrary to Columbia's educational mission. I want to say a bit about a path forward. We've talked a lot about where we should draw lines as a matter of rules, but what is the vision for Columbia over the next decade that I see? And I think it can really be summarized as viewpoint diversity and intellectual rigor. Starting point here is that academic freedom guarantees broad free speech rights across our community. What we want to create at Columbia is a campus that welcomes dissent and values counter views without a single orthodoxy. The fundamental principle here is that sharp disagreement is healthy when it is free of harassment, intimidation, or threats. I think as a community, we need to engage in a self-reflection, moment of self-reflection here, and ask ourselves whether there has been in higher education a decades-long drift towards conformity that has narrowed the range of accepted perspectives. What I would challenge our community to consider is to make a renewed commitment to inviting voices to challenge the prevailing assumptions and thereby enrich our debate. And the key word there really is debate. That what I think makes a university a place where dissent and counter views are welcome is when the environment is one in which ideas can be challenged in a thoughtful and rigorous way. And this is why I think at Columbia, one of our goals should be to create a forum where ideas meet evidence, not slogans. We need to put up arguments that can withstand scrutiny and are not merely rallying cries for passionate activism. This means that we need to encourage the questioning of norms and continuous testing of received wisdom. We should be a community where there are no orthodoxies, but where evidence, data, and science are prevailing in scientific questions and where views can be challenged and throughout the university community on contested questions. This necessitates, this vision of a community where ideas are challenged with evidence necessitates protecting time, place, and manner for discussion so that our scholarship and our intellectual inquiry can proceed without disruption. It's simply not possible to engage in this intellectual inquiry together, this collective discovery of knowledge, when we're interrupted by disruptions. That interferes with our academic mission. Beyond just the negative, saying give us space to conduct what we do at universities, we should aspire to be more than that. We should aspire to hold ourselves to civil standards that elevate discourse while preserving rigorous and robust critique. We should be able to disagree without being disagreeable. We should be able to engage in thoughtful, evidence-based, rigorous critiques that are based on the issues and not based on political or other factors that are outside of our academic mission. Ultimately, Columbia should be a community that is equipped to tackle complex problems through disciplined and diverse reasoning. We should be learning from each other, and we should do so in ways that are recognized as in the academic community, in the production of, as former Yale Law School Dean Robert Post would say, the production of disciplinary knowledge. What is it that a physicist learns about the world? Well, it's given to us through the field of physics. It's a discipline. I want to learn from our great physicists here at Columbia. I similarly want to learn from our humanities faculty. I want to learn from our social science faculty. We should be engaging with each other, both within our disciplines and in cross disciplines, and be the academic community that we are able to be. So with that vision, I hope that that's given you a sense of the future as I see and what I would hope Columbia can become. And I'm looking forward to taking your questions and having a discussion.
Thank you, Professor Mitz. You covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time there. And we're getting a lot of great questions that are very specific to things that you covered, but they deserve some questions. So even before some of the curated questions that we got at registration, I want to make sure that we're addressing some of the things that are coming up in people's minds. And a lot of it has to do with the line between really how the rules at Columbia work and have they been followed or not followed, and it probably requires a couple of case examples of the difference between protected free speech when time and how actually Columbia narrows the moments and the manner and the time, place, and manner of free speech versus what's happening elsewhere with freedom of expression. So I think, for instance, we had unscheduled protests. We had, at hours that are inappropriate. We had people crashing into into classrooms, and making pronouncements and protesting in a way there. Take us through a couple of cases of how and when, where how the rules should be followed, how the rules haven't been followed, and how the university has reacted to the failure to follow the rules.
Thanks, Kurt, on this one. Yeah, this is a big issue. It's very much defined life at Columbia in many ways over the last 18 months. Let's start with the basic principle that it is, we are not the first ones to think about these problems, and there's no reason for us to reinvent the wheel. Not only have other universities struggled with these issues, but the challenge of freedom of expression and demonstrations and protests is one that we see in every municipality across this country. And there are well recognized and well understood ways consistent with the First Amendment and consistent with the Constitution to provide for freedom of expression while doing so in a way that does not interfere with the rest of the community and their rights to free movement and their rights to sleep quietly at night. And so when we talk about time, place, and manner, just as a starting point, this isn't an idea that I came up with or others came up with. This is a long-standing, well-recognized view in every municipality. If you want to have a protest, you'll need a permit once it grows beyond a certain size. Generally, that's just very standard. You're not allowed to protest generally on public sidewalks or areas without permits. There are traffic considerations. There are just normal functioning. And we accept in New York City and elsewhere around the country that these restrictions are entirely consistent with our constitutional rights and with freedom of expression. We don't see a tension between the two. So I think the first question to ask ourselves is, what's to stop us and why is it challenging to adopt that sort of view at Columbia? And in fact, the administration last year had put forth guidance which did exactly that, which established protest zones and hours and a process by which protests could be registered. Again, I think as part of this community conversation, it's important to listen. And I think students often felt that some of those processes were not as clear as they could have been or required excessive advance notice relative to the timing of demonstration. So there was certainly room to make tweaks. And in fact, the interim guidance that the university released last year, about a year ago now, just a little over a year ago, allowed for, I believe, 48-hour notice and did establish demonstration areas. I think that that sort of system, one of the advantages, and I believe this is recognized similarly at Chicago and other institutions that have a protesters' corner, so to speak, one of the advantages of that is that it provides for a clean separation between demonstration activity and academic activity. And the reason why that separation is so critical is because for many of our students, just hearing very loud protests with drums and so forth can be distracting when they're trying to listen to a lecture in a classroom. I mean, this might seem obvious, but just a few days ago, there was a protest on Amsterdam Avenue in which students reported hearing very loudly the drums that were being banged right outside of Amsterdam Gate. So we are, I think, as a community, still struggling a bit. And this was outside the gates, this was off campus, and it's not really Columbia's jurisdiction. So there's a lot of complications with when you get down to the brass tacks of solving these problems. But I think as a community, we've struggled with drawing that line. Maybe the fact that we have an urban campus has something to do with it. We're all very close to each other. And so it's hard to create this sort of healthy separation between academic and non-academic activities. But I think that, while we continue to struggle with these questions, we should start from the basic premise that as an academic institution, Columbia exists to further research and teaching. And if we have to make a trade-off, if we have to decide between these two competing values of research and teaching versus demonstration activity, it's my view that while we should preserve demonstrations and protests as much as possible, if we have to make a decision, we should err on the side of research and teaching while doing our very best to respect the freedom of expression of protesters and demonstrations. So I think fundamentally, time, place, and manner is one of the most core principles to organizing a campus community that's focusing on research and teaching while still allowing for demonstration activity to occur.
Yeah, the time, place, and manner, and that those limits, erring on the side of academic freedom and the core mission of education and research and so on. That seems to be where so many people who are observers, outside of the campus, all of the alumni community, that seems to be the place that is most deeply, most frequently questioned, right? Has Columbia found a balance that's appropriate to its mission and to its context? And I think there's very few people that feel that it has. How are things? Do you see Columbia moving toward a better balance as things stand? And what are the things? And I think just adjudication on the old issues that it came about. How is that progressing or not progressing in your mind?
Well, I think we've made tremendous progress, Kurt, relative to where we were a year ago, and the administration deserves, and the Board of Trustees deserve tremendous credit for that. On adjudication, Columbia announced, I guess it's now over a month ago, disciplinary action in the encampment and Hamilton, the first encampment and in Hamilton Hall cases. And, without commenting on the substance of any given case, I'm not privy to all the evidence that was put forward. I do believe that the university should be commended for the sort of transparent process and accountable process. That was one of the critiques and concerns that had been put forward a year ago, that discipline action was not subject to a transparent process and students felt that due process rights were not being respected. That's really no longer the case. If to the extent it was, it's definitely not the case now. The University Judicial Board is a transparent regime, and we had an appeals process that's been publicly disclosed, and so there's been review of these issues by independent parties. So we've really tried to protect the rights of students to due process. I think one of the challenges that universities have to grapple with is that we're not necessarily well equipped as educational institutions to creating a system of courts and adjudication internally. We're not judges, many of us. Let's just say we might have the occasional judge here or there teaching at the law school, but it's not our area of expertise, and it's very expensive to develop these sorts of systems that protect due process to this degree. And nonetheless, despite the cost, despite the complexity, despite the fact that this is not our area of expertise, so to speak, the university has made it a priority, and it's been something that we've invested in tremendously over the last year, and the results of these cases reflect that. I think going forward, as Acting President Shipman has noted, we're going to have to ask ourselves some questions about what's pragmatic and practical going forward, because we don't want a situation where discipline takes a year in every case. And that sort of undermines, you might say, the purpose of
Absolutely.
accountability as a regime. So we need to have solutions to some of these processes that make sense and that fit the university environment.
Have changes to the judicial review process or what has happened that should make it quicker in the future? I imagine some of it was just the lack of practice at it, and that the UJB hadn't really been active for many years. But are we going to be able to deal with inappropriate with inappropriate protests and going beyond time, place, and manner on a more expeditious basis in the future?
I believe so, Kurt. I'm quite optimistic. We have an outstanding rules administrator in Greg Warrow, who was a political science professor, I believe chaired the department for many years, very thoughtful individual. He's a very committed to the values that are essential for these institutions to function. We have, I know, a commitment on the part of the Board of Trustees and the acting president to take the steps that are necessary to make discipline work effectively at Columbia while protecting the due process rights of students. And, I don't want to prejudge the outcome. The acting president has announced a comprehensive review of the university senate and aspects of our governance so that we can be well equipped to address the challenges that have arisen in recent months and in the last couple years in particular. And I don't want to prejudge the outcome of that process. I think it's going to be as the acting president has stated, a collaborative conversation in which many members of the community will be engaged. But I know that there is a commitment to ensuring that discipline happens both expeditiously and justly, and that we're not convicting the innocent, and that students have due process rights and protection, the protections that they deserve, but that we're also able to be, at the end of the day, a community which pursues our academic mission. And I think we have to remember that discipline is not a discipline is not an end unto itself. It is but a means to an end. And the end is the research and teaching which define our intellectual life at Columbia. So to the extent that student demonstrations are interfering with that goal, that students are taking actions which violate our rules on time, place, and manner, which cross the line into harassment and other forms of unacceptable speech that have gone beyond the protections of freedom of expression, that's actually interfering with our academic mission. And so it is our responsibility to draw a line to protect what makes Columbia great. And so it's not a tension at the end of the day to pursue our mission of world-class research, teaching, and scholarship. It's our responsibility and our obligation to do so here at Columbia.
Yeah, I've long thought that we've let the culture at Columbia, we've lionized protest in a way that's a bit disproportional with the mission of the university. And I think that's a bit of what has gone wrong. And that kind of raises a question for me when we have people violating, and it's a question that quite a few people asked, when we have protest that exceeds the bounds. And really, we're looking at, and really, we get to the point of civil disobedience, occupation of Hamilton Hall, and things of that sort. Um, is there any legitimate basis for civil disobedience, breaking the rules, and there being a just reason that's still in concert with the mission of the university, or is that, or do we have to firmly draw the line that, violating the university's mission in that regard, regardless of the long-term sense of justice behind that violation, that it's not permissible.
Well, Kurt, I think you make an excellent point that civil disobedience has a long storied tradition in the United States of America and globally more broadly. I think one of the core principles of civil disobedience is accepting the consequences of those actions.
Mhm.
It's, the fact that the great heroes in American history were willing to bear the consequences for their actions is a major part of history's judgment on those individuals, that they believed so deeply in the truth, in the just nature of their cause, that they were willing to suffer the consequences, whether that was imprisonment or otherwise. And what I find most concerning about the wave of protests and other activity which has violated Columbia rules is that it has often been conducted by individuals who have tried to escape accountability for their actions, most commonly through facial coverings, which often full facial coverings, which obscure identity to the degree that they cannot easily be identified and held accountable without an extended, complex investigation that sometimes isn't even possible. And so civil disobedience is a core virtue in both American history and I think in democratic societies. But civil disobedience without consequences, well, I'm not familiar. To me, that's just anarchy. And at the end of the day, as an educational institution, we have an obligation to pursue our educational mission. Now, let me be clear. Columbia is an environment where dissent is welcome. And when I set forth our educational mission and our purpose, I started with the premise that dissent and passionate disagreement are the building blocks of what makes higher education what it is. So there is an alternative to civil disobedience at Columbia, and it's respectful, thoughtful, intellectual engagement. Higher education is hardly really at its core an ivory tower. I think we try to be an open forum and welcoming the perspectives of those who disagree in a thoughtful way. Well, that's definitional to who we are. So if you have strong views on the conflict in Gaza, for example, I welcome that debate. I welcome that disagreement. I think it is essential that that be modeled. And I'll just give one simple example from the last, from the post-October 7th period. The Dean of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, Karen Yarkin-Milo, and the Dean of Princeton's Public Policy School, Amani Jamal, came together to write an op-ed and this was shortly after the October 7th attacks, in which they basically together sought to engage and find common ground and showcase as academic leaders the sort of discourse and disagreement and thoughtful, respectful conversation from an Israeli and a Palestinian coming together and having these sorts of conversations that really make what higher education is. At the end of the day, this is the kind of environment we want to be, a place where people who see the world very differently can listen to each other, can learn from each other, can agree and find common ground, and can also disagree and show each other how they see the world. And I think that's the promise and potential of higher education. So for me, it's not about whether you obey or disobey. It's about whether you're realizing the opportunity that higher education in general and that Columbia gives you to engage and learn from those who see the world differently.
Yeah. You're really pointing to to something that's close to my heart. It's the difference between civil disobedience and civil discourse, right? And the irony at Columbia is that we have the core curriculum where that is supposed to happen every day of the week, in colloquia, where people take the great texts of our civilization and Eastern, I mean global civilization, and very often it comes down to topics of the day of intense interest or matters of disagreement. It gets contemporized. Um, your path forward is very much about something that I've been calling, the core and the quad. Take it out of the classroom, and it needs to be into the public elements of our culture. Um, where are we doing that? Besides the professors speaking to each other and trying to and modeling for the rest of us, for the rest of the community, how that might happen. Do we have other places on campus where that is happening, or we have the seeds of that? And how do we build that culture? And as a corrective to the type of protest where somebody says, "I'm not even interested in listening to you," right? Which happened many times on both sides of the debates after October 7th.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely a vision. I mean, I'm a faculty member, so I start with the classroom because I'm in the classroom a lot. And I think at the very least, we need to model this, not just professor to professor, but professor to student. I'll tell you, I'll give away a little secret of my classes. Is I start each semester by telling my students, if you disagree with me, you'll get extra participation credit, extra points for your final grade. And ironically, I think that's actually really important at a university because in order to create an environment where students feel free to challenge each other, they also have to feel free to challenge the professor. And of course, the common theme here is to do so in a thoughtful and rigorous way based on the readings and based on the material that we've discussed in class. We are, at the end of the day, an educational community. And so education is what we do. We educate each other, we learn from each other, and we engage with each other. Now, Kurt, you're making the excellent point that need not be limited to the classroom, that you could have this sort of engagement out on the quad. You could have it happening in the dining halls. I will say the university has taken a step in that direction, a tremendous step through the launching of the Trust Collaboratory, which is an initiative to have listening tables where members of the community can share their experiences with each other. I had the privilege just before spring break of hosting a listening table and hearing the perspectives of international students who were terrified and are terrified by some of the actions that have been taken by the Trump administration. And I've written an op-ed on deportations and with one of my colleagues here at the law school, Dave Posen, we wrote on how deportations as a means of resolving difficult questions of speech can be toxic and corrosive to the campus environment. And we should be a community where we're drawing these lines ourselves and we're giving our students the space to engage in a thoughtful and meaningful manner. So I think what I learned from the listening session is that we have a lot of work to do to engage with each other in these conversations outside the classroom as well. I think we need more in this direction, Kurt. I think we need to see a lot more of these sorts of conversations happening, and we should really normalize engagement with people who we don't agree with and with people who see the world differently. Of course, there have to be lines and there has to be boundaries like in any discussion. And hopefully it's one that is as academic as can be, because that's what we are. We're an educational community where we learn we don't just share opinions, we try and link those opinions to the wisdom of others and to the literature and to the evidence and hopefully teach each other. And I want our students to see that as a vision for even engaging with each other on complex and divisive topics.
Yeah, I believe that Dean Sword is the scholars program, that there's now an element of people who have participated in the listening tables and have come up with research ideas, progressing that and getting some funding in order to take that a little bit further into the culture, on the quad. So stay tuned. Let's stay tuned and
Okay.
see how
Excellent.
that plays out. Um, you spoke briefly about the deportations, and that brings up for many of the questions that we're getting on the administration's pressures and tactics on Columbia and other universities. And maybe maybe you could give us a sense of I'm sure you can't speak to the negotiations that are ongoing, but um, can you give us some perspective on on the strategy that Columbia has taken versus the strategy, a much more resistant strategy that Harvard has taken and other universities are kind of that are starting to line up with, and really, what's different, and is really much already determined, or is it still a very fluid situation? I don't know. Just help us kind of look at that whole complexity that's popped up in the last couple of weeks.
Look, let me say this is a complex and very challenging moment for higher education, and particularly the administration and faculty of universities in this country. Um, I won't be able to comment on Columbia's particular situation, but I'm happy to talk about some of the issues in general that I think every university is facing here. I think we have to start with the basic fact that the modern research university looks very different than universities did maybe 50 or 60 years ago, certainly in the pre-war era, but even immediately following World War II. We still had a different scale of federal involvement in higher education than we do today. And it's just a fact that so much of the research that's being produced by the medical school, by our life sciences more broadly, by the engineering school and other parts of the university really would not be possible without federal funding, at least in the current form. And we can have a conversation, and I think it would be an essential conversation to have about potentially becoming independent of the federal government. And I think it'd be a fascinating discussion. I don't know if it's possible. I'm not the best person to answer that question because I'm a law professor. I don't rely on federal funding, at least for my research directly. I don't have research grants. So I couldn't tell you whether there are alternatives. But I do think that as an institution today, Columbia, Harvard, other leading institutions of higher education, we are fundamentally dependent on the federal government in ways that, for funding research, in ways that were simply not the case decades ago. Given that that's the situation, what we're really struggling with, I think, as an industry is how to manage that relationship in a way that is consistent fundamentally with our values. And what I want to suggest is that this is not a binary either or distinction. I don't believe that at its core, this is fundamentally a choice between resistance and capitulation. Those are polar opposites conceptually, that's true. But I think every institution which sees federal funding in its future is going to have to both stand for its values and also manage its relationship with the federal government in a productive way and in a way that empowers the university's mission. And this is a point that I think is sometimes overlooked in the debate. A core value of the university is freedom of expression and intellectual autonomy, institutional autonomy, academic freedom. I started with that in my slide. That's a core value which makes us who we are as universities. But in order to pursue knowledge in the sciences and medicine and similar fields, we need funding, we need money. And so these two values that we're discussing, the need to pursue knowledge and the need to do so in a way that is consistent with our mission in the pursuit of truth, ultimately, I don't believe, Kurt, that these are fundamentally in tension. That in order to pursue knowledge, we need to do so in a way that preserves our values. But in order to pursue knowledge, we also need funding. I would recommend for everyone listening, there's an alumni organization, Stand Columbia, which has done a lot of excellent work analyzing the financial data which are out there and quantifying the various locations of exposure and magnitudes of exposure that Columbia has to federal funding across a number of areas. Regardless of whatever your views are on where we should draw the line and what exactly tactics should be for any given institution, I think we would all be well served by having a deep understanding of the facts. In what areas are we vulnerable? What parts of our research are dependent on grants and contracts? Where are we dependent on student loans? Where are we dependent on other forms of federal assistance? The endowment, how does it play a role? I have found that the more informed our community members are on the details, the more meaningful and constructive the conversations can be. So I would encourage everyone listening, to go to Stand Columbia, to read their various explainers, to really acquire an understanding for yourself of the various dimensions of Columbia's exposure, Harvard's exposure, understand the ways in which institutions produce knowledge through this partnership with the federal government. Now, does that mean that the federal government should have a veto or should be able to dictate what we're doing at Columbia? Of course not. Of course, academic freedom at its core means the freedom to pursue knowledge without political interference. So what we have to solve, Kurt, is how to reconcile fundamentally the core value that defines Columbia of academic freedom with our relationship with the federal government. And I just make one more brief point on this, which is that, as I said during my presentation, as an industry, higher education at its core should be a place in which all viewpoints are welcome. We should not have intellectual orthodoxies. And I believe, this is my personal view, that much of the animosity towards higher education today, at least in part, is coming from people who have felt that universities were not always welcoming and accepting of views which deviated from certain orthodoxies. And I'm not the only one saying this. I think many leaders in higher education are saying we need to engage in an exercise of self-reflection where we ask ourselves, can we do better? Can we do better at accommodating voices which have different opinions, maybe from various consensus that has emerged in different ways? And I would say that as a community, we can do better in that area. And that by doing so, it is my hope that we would see greater support for higher education in the American public. That would in turn free us to pursue our mission if we had deeper and broader support for what we're doing here at universities.
It feels like maybe even three of the themes that you've talked about fit together with those last comments, Professor Metz. You have if you have a lack of diverse thinking and you have orthodoxies, even if they're unspoken or unacknowledged, that suppress viewpoint diversity with, and that seeps into the culture, that seeps into the admissions process, that seeps into the grant making process and the way the funding is coming together. That's that took decades to create that, those blinders or that sort of that narrowness that's being critiqued so savagely and politically right now by people who are unhappy with what that orthodoxy is. How do we turn that ship around quickly? Or because I could imagine that some people are thinking, let's just tough it out, and we'll just tough it out for 4 years, and then it's back to the game, versus really going through that self-reflection and that transformation. It will be a transformation if universities, higher education in America makes the kind of changes that you're advocating.
Well, I'll say this. I think that we have a lot of work to do, both in terms of identifying how we can do better at fulfilling our mission and our purpose and really giving expression to these core values that we've been discussing. I also think the challenges that we're facing today in higher education are challenges that we can solve. And I guess I'm fundamentally optimistic, Kurt, that Columbia, I mean, this will sound trite, but Columbia's best days are really before us. I think this process we've been through, this painful year and a half, has given us the opportunity to engage in the sort of reflection that will ultimately make us a better community. I guess I'm an optimist in that I believe that if we focus on our mission and our values and what makes us who we are, what makes us a leading institution of higher education, that a lot of the specific problems that are surfacing right now are going to ultimately be addressed. I think we're going to, if we focus, for example, on doing what we do, on fulfilling our mission of academic freedom and accommodating diverse viewpoints, if we really commit ourselves to that vision, we will win back the trust of the American people. If we win back the trust of the American people, it will be a lot harder to defund an institution that has won the trust of the American people. So the message I say a lot to faculty and others who ask me, what should we do next? I say, let's go back to core principles, who we are as an institution, and let's recommit to fulfilling our mission. If we can do that, then ultimately, I believe the country will be behind us. And so I encourage all of us, all of you listening, to partner with us. I mean, we need you. We need your help. We need your thoughtful voices. We need your input. I want to hear from you. I want to have coffee with you. I want to engage with you. I want you to talk to colleagues. This is the time for Columbia to come together. This is the time for alumni to link arms with faculty to say, let's recommit to these core values. Let's take the institution to really be back to this place where we're able to pursue our academic purpose and thereby win back the trust of the American people. I think this is ultimately, Kurt, at its core, it's not really, and I say this in the deep way, it's not really a negotiation. It's not really a political battle. It's not really, at its core, it's about an institution of higher education becoming what it can become. It's about our self-transformation as a community. And if we focus there and we do what needs to be done, then I believe the rest will fall into place because we will have committed to and engaged in the kind of deep searching reflection and transformation which justifies the federal partnership, which justifies the sorts of investments that the country and the world have made in higher education over the last 50, 60 years.
Be careful what you ask for. That kind of participation, you'll get a lot of it.
Hey, I'm
I mean,
ready. We need as much help as we can get here, Kurt.
I think
the
send
task
that message.
is substantial. Yeah.
Send
Formidable.
that message to the trustees and to the administration. I mean, we would love to engage more on this because we think it's a very diverse community. If you look at the Q&A, and I'm sorry, everyone, I can't get to all these great questions, but you have people on both sides of the fence here, on the political fence, obviously, um, and there's a wealth. There's a wealth of information, a wealth of knowledge and perspectives and diversity that would come through that kind of engagement. Is that starting to happen within the campus community right now? Is there are there dialogues happening about higher education, how Columbia, recentering on its mission and how it goes about governing itself? That is outside of the specific problems that it's faced?
Absolutely, Kurt. I mean, this is what I find so exciting about Acting President Shipman's most recent announcement that we are engaging in this process of reflection and community conversation around our governance and our institutions. Because that's at the end of the day what all great institutions do. They go through a process of self-reflection. They from time to time ask themselves, do we need to make changes? Are we best equipped for the challenges that 2025 and 2026 and the next decade are going to put before us? And the answer here at the end of the day, I think, is that we as a community need to engage in that very conversation you're describing. I will tell you that one of the upsides, if you can think of what's sort of the silver linings of the last year and a half, is that as a community, I believe we've come to appreciate the perspectives you're describing, the perspectives of alumni, of thoughtful, engaged stakeholders in ways that, maybe in prior years we didn't quite see as essential as we do now. I think now we understand that our survival, not just survival, our ability to flourish as an institution really depends fundamentally on engagement in building bonds here, both with internal communities and external communities, both between faculty members and with our alumni and broader Columbia community. And I think that requires all of us to commit to the process that we're describing here, which is to engage in these conversations, to ask the hard questions. Are our institutions able to fulfill the purpose that they were intended to in this new era? What needs to change so that we can be agile and adapting to the challenges that we're facing today? And we need to hear from you, and we need to have this conversation, which is a constructive conversation about how Columbia ultimately as an institution can flourish. So yes, I believe that conversation is already happening. It's happening internally. It's happening externally. Here we are sitting together on a webinar having it. And I'm looking forward to more engagement like this, because I think this is how we learn from each other. It's how we give expression to this vision of what Columbia can be. And it's how you help us make Columbia together a better place.
This transformation is, how is, Professor Mitz, how is institutional neutrality, which is another thing that Columbia has been working toward and discussing. How does that fit in with this viewpoint diversity, with the other themes that and freedom of expression? How does that fit in and help, or does it? Give us a point of view on it.
Well, I've written an op-ed on this also, so
Okay.
happy to speak a little bit about it. I mean, institutional neutrality, I think, at its core, enables viewpoint diversity. It empowers viewpoint diversity, and the reason is that if an institution takes a position, it's not impossible for faculty at that institution to disagree with it, but it becomes harder. It becomes harder because junior faculty, non-tenured faculty, staff, students, justifiably might worry that if they express a view that's counter to the institution's view, they will face adverse repercussions. So institutional neutrality, in my view, is really a cornerstone for the sort of engaged, thoughtful discourse that reflects a diverse range of opinions, as we've been describing. Now, look, that's not to say that there won't be edge cases and lines to draw, particularly when members of the community are affected, or when there are issues that are part of the core of our institutional commitment. And again, I'm giving you my opinion here. We've established a committee on institutional voice, which will give its perspective on these questions. And so I don't purport to speak for the trustees or for the institution. I'm speaking purely for myself here, but I see this as a core value that advances what Columbia's mission really is in the pursuit of knowledge and accommodating a wide range of views on complex and controversial and contested topics. The only other thing I'll say is that it's certainly true that institutional neutrality I think for lots of people, raises people have strong feelings as to when neutrality is deployed. Maybe it's deployed in one context and not another. And I do think we need to be thoughtful and reflective and make sure that if we make a commitment to institutional neutrality, that it be a genuine one, that it hold across time, across issues, that it not be something that's brought out for one issue and not for another. I take those criticisms. I believe they're on point. And part of this process of learning and discourse is saying, let's make sure that if we do make this commitment to institutional neutrality, that we hold to it. And then, of course, there will always be issues that have to be figured out, anti-discrimination and other challenges. But let's make that commitment. If this is the view that the community takes, it's what I think we should do. Let's hold fast to it and let's move forward as a community in a way that it ultimately enables different points of view to flourish on campus without there being, in a sense, an orthodoxy or an institutional perspective that stifles that sort of healthy dissent and disagreement that we want to have on campus.
In a way, it's analogous to with the rules of conduct that it be used impartially and without relation to content, right, or topic, or as much as
That's
possible.
exactly right. That's exactly right. And we talked about, you could say content neutrality in the rules of university conduct is simply a companion to or complementary to institutional neutrality from a PR standpoint, or what content neutrality is to the rules, institutional neutrality is to public affairs. I mean, those are sort of shorthand ways of making the point that these are actually sibling principles. These are principles that go together. They are principles that are consistent with and actually empower freedom of expression on campus.
Okay. We are we've been going for 75 minutes and I have barely scratched the surface with the questions that people are asking, but I've tried to have a general discussion with you and query you in ways that are thematic with the questions and but without pointing to any one particular one. There's over 38 that have been submitted at this moment in time, and there were 15 or so that we got a pre-registration. So people would like us to dig into much more specific responses on where the institution is with its negotiations with the administration, whether or not it can pivot and why, a lot of questions, which are ones which I think you've said that you're not in a position to address. So I think I have to call it a great conversation and stop it here, versus rolling into other topics like the shared governance structure at Columbia or some of the op-ed pieces that have been in Spectator, which you've kind of referred to on the fourth grade purpose of the university, which President Bollinger had proposed years ago, and which had advocacy at the university, which ties into whether or not it's institutionally neutral and some of the other things. And I would recommend to everybody that they read the Spectator almost every day right now. It's an exciting moment in the Spectator's journalism in terms of the range of opinions and the debate that's going on is fantastic. And it's great to that you're a contributor to it, Professor Mitz, and we kind of look forward to your additional contributions in the future, and we will definitely call upon you in the future to give us more of your wisdom and your perspective on these topics and others.
Well, let me just say, Kurt, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you and with everyone here. This has been just a really fascinating, engaging conversation, and I feel like these issues are, among the most intellectually interesting. I mean, you mentioned the Spectator writing, publishing a lot. I think as a community, we've rarely had moments like these where we're all so invested in what are deep and important questions and challenges about Columbia in particular, but really about higher education more broadly. So it's been a real privilege and treat to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity.
And again, thank you for your time and your preparation and everything. And we look forward to hearing more from you and hearing a little bit about the seminar that you're teaching as well on free expression. Thank you again. All right.
Thank you.
Everyone,
Terrific.
have a good day. We've got something lined up for May. It will be colloquium style, where we work with Professor Neer, who did one last semester. This one will be on Hannah Arendt, and we're still scheduling that date for either late May or early June. That'll be one where there will be sort of a classroom kind of discussion after reading the material, which will be put forward in advance. So please register for that if you're interested in it. And send us your ideas on next year. We're looking forward to having lively debates in different styles, webinars and colloquia next year with all of you and many others. So spread the word. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.